Everything's slow today. Bam.
Right. This is Will Riley, and you are watching the Break It Down show.
All right. For once, I was the one causing the big delay.
Uh,
The worm has turned. It's funny. I like to when I watch news. I don't watch a lot of pre-digested news. I watch as raw as possible. So I was watching the. I guess we call it the press conference between the boss of South Africa and the boss of America, Donald Trump, and it got a little contentious. I mean, definitely, we're seeing a lot of sausage making. First off, what are your thoughts on this process of saying, "Hey, we're going to talk out loud about some of this stuff"? Can you hear me? Can I hear you? Are we hearing each other? Hmm. No luck today. No luck today. Assuming that I'm the one that is live and talking, I will talk to you all, and hopefully we will go. I see that we're having a problem going live to X for some reason. Who knows why? And I don't have Will, so I don't know where Will went. Maybe I'm the one that's gone, but I don't think so. So I guess if you're watching, let me know in the comments. Are you hearing me or are you hearing Will? Because I don't hear anything right now. Here's Pete from the Break It Down Show. You guys should go check out Will Riley's books. They are wonderful. He writes a lot of them, and he's an exciting dude. So, I don't know what's going on here. I think that's Will that's stuck. So let's see if we can't unstick him. And I'll keep talking. Yeah, so Will has a bunch of books out on Amazon. I'm going to pull the link up for those right now. You just go in general. So anytime you use my links, by the way, I get a little kickback from Amazon for these things. Don't really care where you buy things from, but if you think of it, that's a good way, a small way to support the show. Aha, I think we've got Will back now. Welcome back.
sorry, we had some kind of electrical flicker down here. So you're asking me what I think about Trump's meeting with Ramaphosa?
Yeah, like doing it out loud like that too. Are you okay with that in terms of foreign policy and policy in general?
Well, I don't think that's ideal. Like we've both been in leadership roles, and you've done that on the military side. And I think in general, there are a lot of meetings where guys are screaming at each other, but that's usually behind closed doors. And I felt the same way about Trump and Vance and Zelensky when they walked into the room to do what was supposed to be the announcement of a minerals deal in exchange for continued aid, and they just all ended up yelling at each other, with Vance saying, like, "You've never said thank you." All that you really leave to the sideline, or even you leave to the aides, and you have the meeting amongst yourselves with the knowledge that you're going to come to a conclusion, I think. So I'm not a fan of that style, but I mean, I actually think it's totally fair, if you're going to do that style, to call out what's going on in South Africa. And I'll actually rant about South Africa for a minute or so. Like,
Please.
South Africa in the 1990s, this was sort of the cause. I was in high school, maybe college at the end of this period, and people would build like apartheid style shanty towns on the lawn of major colleges like Illinois and Brown University. And Nelson Mandela was presented as a sort of secular saint. Like, the problem is these evil white people, they're oppressing these brilliant, high IQ black people. And if we just get the apartheid regime out of there, things will be perfect. There was never the consideration of, maybe all these people down there are led by jackasses and have a long history of fighting each other. And I was, to the extent I'm a geek at all, I was a history geek, and I'd read the Washing of the Spears, the books about the Zulu War, and I knew that the reality was, like, the Boers, the British, the Zulus, and the Xhosa had all invaded the country and fought each other for a very long time. Like, I didn't think there would be a magical, positive conclusion if you got rid of the Van Clerk, the apartheid government. But anyway, that was the whole narrative. We saw movies like Invictus. It was just, Mandela has giant statues all throughout the country. The reality of post-apartheid South Africa is that the country, if anything, has gotten slightly worse. I mean, the ANC government is roughly as corrupt as the apartheid government was. They literally took the laws that regulated what blacks could do, like the percentage of employees in a business can't be over 30% black, crossed out black and wrote in white. You might correct me, but that happened like 94 times. There's a policy in South Africa called BEE, Black Economic Empowerment, where you have quotas to make for employees at every level, usually around 60%. That's just blacks. Now, understand South Africa also has large colored, Indian, so on communities. Zulus and so on who live in their homelands, I don't think are considered South African black for proportional terms. So you have this whole melange of people you have to push in there before you can hire any white people who are still the near majority of college graduates. So huge areas of the country are falling apart. I think the presentation of this in kind of white conservative media can be exaggerated, but I have friends that live in Josie in Johannesburg, and none of the streetlights in the town work. Like the last one went out last year, and there was a mix of people, like both black and white, around it with phones taking pictures. Like it was this cultural icon. It was the last sign of civilization. And part of this whole thing in South Africa has been that the Boers, the Dutch farmers, are the target of extreme violence.
Mm.
So over the past year, I believe there were 270 murders. A common estimate is 1% of 27,000 murders in the country. I could easily be an error there, but concentrated within this agrarian white community of around 43,000 people. And I broke that down on Twitter the other day because people are saying that's a tiny number. And what you get is that that's a murder rate of 628 per 100,000 people, which is
Oof.
crazy. Like the black
Yeah.
murder rate in New Orleans is 67, I think. So, a tenth of that would be one of the highest murder rates in the world. And I don't think we're looking at a tenth of that. So the whole thing with these South African farmers, Trump granted them asylum. Now, most of them are tough guys too. They shoot back when their farms are invaded. They own a lot of nice land, so most aren't coming. But we got a first tranche of them that was more than 60 people like a week ago. So this is a current active issue. Like there are these people that are leaving the country and saying the old government, the new government's no better than the old government, and I think it might genocide me. And so Trump presented that publicly to an African leader, and the media went crazy because a prominent black person had been corralled in public and accused of racism. It's kind of like the equivalent of spitting on a statue of a saint to a lot of people at the New York Times or the WAPO. But I mean, I think if you're going to do that style at all, this is a pretty good time to do it. Again, you could just take Ramaphosa behind a closed door and threaten him with the loss of the oil deal, and I mean that would have the same effect.
Right, right. What are your thoughts on compare and contrast Zimbabwe / Rhodesia to South Africa? Are these good proxies for one another? And has it worked in Rhodesia, then turned into Zimbabwe?
Well, I think that this is an interesting question because I'm a pretty ruthless, in the civilian sense, conservative businessman. I'll give my opinion on racial issues and so on, but I'm not actually a racist. I think there are a lot of obviously highly functioning black governments. You look at Botswana, Bermuda, Bahamas, Barbados. I obviously think there are a lot of high functioning white governments, and I don't just mean Western European. I'm talking Eastern European down into the stands. So I mean, most people say sometimes culture is racial. I don't see that as true. Based on the simple sense that everyone in the world now uses gunpowder, which was invented by the Chinese, uses a democratic model that comes out of Britain, so on down the line. Well, out of the USA as much. I mean, I guess you could look at the Venetian Republic, but anyway, who cares? Everyone can adopt these things. Everyone can send kids to school in grade grouped units and so on. So when I think about the situation in Africa, I don't think that what Africa needed was strictly white colonialism going forward, which is the argument a lot of people make that have like the shirtless Rhodesian boys as their profile picture. If you've seen that on social media, these brave kids holding guns, looking out of helicopters. Rhodesia was a mid-sized, lower-income country that had the life expectancy of a horse. Basically, I mean, it wasn't in place for very long. It had one functional city, really. Whites and black hated each other. But I mean, so I guess the first point would be, I think obviously a lot of Africa, if you look at Lagos or Cairo or Nairobi today, is in a much better income position for blacks and whites than was the case when Rhodesia existed. But two, any sane person has to admit that Zimbabwe was a retreat away from what Rhodesia built. Like when Bob Mugabe took power, he intentionally started targeting whites, and he intentionally started targeting successful people, which I'll get to in a second. But I mean, the results were pretty predictable. One of his targets was the agricultural sector, which is often the case in Africa and Latin America, because what you wind up with in these semi-feudal societies is what are sometimes called haciendados. There are a few families, often racial minorities, that own most of the land. And other people who are often quite loyal to them of various races work on the land as cowboys, farmers, fighting retainers. animal breeders, that kind of thing. And in Zimbabwe, you had a bunch of these farms. So you had a white population was only like 2%, but you had something like 15,000 whites that owned the majority of the arable land in the country. And what Bob Mugabe did was send mobs of people. The term for them is woe vets, said like that, like woe vets. But there were war veterans from the Bush War against the whites. Like they would go to these farms, which were defended. They were like defended camps. You'd need like a company to take one. So his strategy was to send 3 companies of like former fighting men. They'd break down the fence. They'd take the outbuildings. They'd take the core house. There was a lot of rape, a lot of murder. And then the people, the woe vets, would settle in on the farm. And the idea was, well, we're going to have these black people who are descended from traditional farmers take over the white farms. The problem is that they didn't know how to farm like that. They could manage like 40 acres, but they didn't know how to use industrial combines and so on. So everybody starved. I mean, there are all these hilarious images of these 5 tough-looking, like gunnery sergeant type guys trying to operate. I mean, have you ever seen a driving combine? It's not like the red tractor in the pictures. I mean, the thing's a story tall. You've got guys looking under it, trying to adjust the blades. Nobody knows what they're doing. The farmer, who's as scrappy as any of them and who they just beat in a fight, isn't going to help them. So it's just the production of food dropped 40 or 50%. And you started seeing these images of like grass growing through the beautifully paved streets of the capital as the different ethnic groups fought and as food stopped coming in from the outside. They've recovered a little bit since after a great deal of death, but Zimbabwe is still kind of a disaster zone. In an entertaining note, the popular daughter of one of the farmers that successfully resisted, however, is currently Miss Africa.
Oh,
so this is one of those random things. So if you Google Miss Zimbabwe, she's a blonde Caucasian woman. There's still white people in the country, in the cities, but they tend not to be farmers.
Right.
Is there some kind of feedback going on one of our ends?
Possibly. I don't hear it. Maybe that's because it's me. I don't know. Do you? I don't know.
I don't think it's a big deal. I've heard it.
Okay. I'll turn my mic off when you're talking.
Okay.
The other thing I wanted to say is, places like Tunisia, Tanzania, these places are largely safe for most people. Tanzania, pretty safe in general, but Tunisia, stay away from the neighboring states like Libya, and you're pretty good to go. So Africa is a place of a lot of different types of states that are in different states of statehood. We're going to use the same word over and over again. And so a place like Zimbabwe or right now South Africa, for them to be some turmoil, that's normal on that giant continent, but it's only normal because it's such a big place and it's so varied culturally and socially and everything else. So this problem exists in other places where there are terror groups and there's a long history of hacking off arms and all kinds of things. You go to Liberia and you have trouble. You go to Rwanda. I mean, all these places are places that we know from the last 30 years of history. And so when I think about South Africa, it's not a problem that I care to try to figure out the answer for because I got enough problems here. But when I think about that, and 5% or so ownership of land, or 5% of the population owns the bulk of the land, is there some way to balance that? Is that, how do you do that, right? How do you create the modern farming capacity to be able to fix an electric motor, a diesel motor, a gas motor, whatever? It's not easy being a farmer. So is this a racial thing? Is it a qualification thing? And then what is the president of South Africa supposed to do about all of that?
Well, that's the last one's a good question. So, I mean, in Africa, in practice, it often is a racial thing because the people with the most first world qualifications are going to be white. And that's an awkward result of the fact that the whites won the war. I mean, people often underestimate the level of technology in Black Africa. So on like Twitter or something, people will talk about, the natives are throwing spears with stone tips. I mean, not really. Like most of them were at about a medieval knight level. If you look at the Ashanti, like they were the cavalry riding on horses with steel plates and so on. The problem is that by this time, if you're looking at the 1800s, the scramble for Africa, that was 300 or 400 years in the past for the whites because Africa was more isolated. So you had people with Maxim guns taking on medieval cavalry, or in the Zulu case, medieval infantry, literally spearmen backed up by longbowmen with like weapon tips made of kind of cheap non-carbon steel. I mean, so like the Africans generally lost. And as a result of that, the people who settled into the African states like SA and who became the doctors, the lawyers, the engineers were white. I mean, in South Africa, I believe 1% of engineers are black today. So when you say, like, is the president targeting whites or is he targeting skilled farmers? 97% of the skilled farmers are going to be white. I think they robbed the black farmers too in Zimbabwe, but that's irrelevant. That's just an interesting book about the 3% black farmers.
Right.
Um, so your first question, like, will South Africa become what Zimbabwe did? I don't really think so, but
Okay.
it'll be on that ladder. Like with South Africa, what you're probably going to see, because you have a big black middle class that's pretty smart. You have the whites are 10%, not 2%. I mean, and they're coalitions within South Africa, like the Indians, the quote unquote coloreds, the large Malay business community, which out earns most of the whites. Those people aren't going to let the country collapse, and everyone has a gun. So, I mean, I don't think you're going to see genocide in any real sense, which would be like the wiping out of half of the whites, 3.5% of the population or 5% of the population. But I think what you'll probably see is stagnating progress instead of improvement. So if we saw this with kind of black Americans in the 1960s, right? Because I mean, we changed the law so that competition for jobs and so on was roughly equal. But at the same time, like the functional aspects of the black community were very much downplayed, like welfare and so on boosted the black illegitimacy rate up to about 70%. So you would have expected after the Civil Rights Act to see black incomes go up on a trend line. What you actually saw was them go up for a bit and then kind of flatten out because there's a positive force, but there's a negative force. And that's probably what you'll see in South Africa. Like there's the positive force of technological change, actually decreasing racism, believe it or not. They don't hate each other as much as they did in the 80s. But then there's the negative force of the incompetent ANC run government making putting this yoke on the most productive people. So I don't think they'll Zimbabwe out. I just don't think they'll be, I don't know how long they'll stay as a BRICS level power, for example. But last thing, your best question was, what's Ramaphosa supposed to do about that? And it's a tough question, right? Because Ramaphosa is black. I mean, he's on the center left. And so you're in this country where the most of the farmland is controlled by 10% of the population, which is defending it with weapons. So if you're a black guy in Cape Town who is like a paralegal, which is a black dominated field, you're going to be living an okay life, upper middle class there, kind of lower middle class here. You have a car, but you're going to be looking at these images on the television screen of these people that own these giant game ranches, basically. Like they're parts of South Africa where you can go to hunt lions. So there's a guy living in an inn in the center of his lands with zebras walking around. And the question has to become, well, why can't I get some of that? We won the last war. They may have won the first one. Why don't I get some of this land? And there actually is an answer. And that answer is because you're not competent to run it. Like your son might be, who's going to be married to his daughter, but you have no idea how to run a giant farm. But people don't want to hear that. People don't want to hear like our group is underperforming.
Mm. Yeah, well, that's hard to hear, and especially if you're over here and you have a certain political belief. It's funny how we all can prove ourselves to be assholes. Okay, we don't want any immigrants to come in, except for these ones who are white from South Africa. And then the flip side of that, the left side of the argument is, it's racism everywhere, right? And maybe it is, but it's probably not the flavor of racism that they want it to be or need it to be. So these are complex issues. Why do we care here so much about it? So much so that we put our president and their president in the same room to have this open discussion that was potentially problematic, potentially part of the solution. I don't know. Donald Trump works in weird ways.
I mean, I think, like I said, Trump is a fan of a bombacious style of leadership that I'm actually not a fan of. I mean, that's why the two guys again were in the room yelling at each other. I would have avoided that. But why does South Africa matter? I don't think it does actually, but it's important to a lot of people because it's symbolic. This is the same situation with like Israel and Gaza. Like these play into American narratives. Because there really was a point in American history where it seemed like to a naive person, all the good guys were black and all the bad guys were white. And that's a big part of our founding mythology, right? Like we carved our country away from brutal, ruthless British Empire. Like we've all seen The Patriot. We had our flaws, but we became a democracy. By fairly early on in most states, women could vote. By 1865, blacks could vote. But there were still imperfections. So part two of the legendary narrative is then Martin and Malcolm marching side by side with the country's leading rabbis, like everyone together. we overthrew the vile descendants of the Confederates in the South. We tore down their statues. We made an integrated modern America. So that's a big part of our picture. And when we see countries that seem to like be groupable into that narrative, there's a tendency to do so. So like the Israel-Palestine thing, I mean, a lot of which side you fall on is kind of which side you view as analogous to the oppressed blacks and maybe Jews of the 50s. So is it the Palestinians who are being kept in these sort of garrisoned ghetto regions in Israel? Now, the reason for that is that they keep attacking the state of Israel with military grade weaponry. Like they're some of the least sympathetic people on earth. But nonetheless, like, is that who you identify with? Are those the blacks? Or are the blacks the Jews who finally carved a state out of their ancient homeland and are surrounded by 52 hostile Muslim countries? So people are putting this into this kind of oppressor-oppressed narrative. And I don't really think it fits. I mean, a friend jokingly asked me once at a bar, actually, excuse me, you know, aren't the Jews and the Arabs the two richest groups on earth? Because I often publish this kind of data and like they're both right up there. And, you know, I said, well, kind of. And the question was then, well, why are we paying them both to fight each other? You know, like in reality, does this resemble our own foundation myth at all? And probably not. But it's the same thing with South Africa. I mean, you have the whites, the blacks, and you again can pick a set of good guys. Is it the black people who were held down and brutalized for 100 years? Or is it the white people who made the entire modern country possible and now are being threatened with genocide? And people are again putting like money down on their preferred race. You know, is either one actually all that sympathetic? Not really, but that's not how the narrative works.
Mm. One of the things I've had this conversation about South Africa a lot of times in my life because I've happened to know some South African people, and you hear both sides of these stories, and you're forced to deal with the fact that like I don't know what the answer is. It's much like the Balkan area where who owns what. God damn it, I don't know. You know, you go back 100 years, somebody different. Go back 100 years, somebody different. Until you have this melange, going back to your term, and you're like, I don't know which asshole to pick because you're all assholes. So we're gonna go against the Serbs. You know, that's our pick, right? But the Serbs have a legitimate claim to all that land. If you've been in a place for centuries, aren't you from there? I mean, aren't you indigenous to that place? At some point, you have to belong to that place. On the other side, can a place just simply reject you and say you're never part of this place? Even if, like, if I moved to Florida and lived there for 50 years, am I a Floridian? Yes. No. Oh, okay. What am I supposed to do about that, right?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, so the concept of play. Could you remind me what you were saying immediately before the Floridian thing? Because that was pretty funny. It distracted me actually.
Okay. Just, you know, when do you get to belong to a place? Like I'm indigenous from the United States, right? It makes me indigenous from North America, and someone who's got hundreds of years of history in a place, are they not from that place? Are they not?
Okay, yeah.
You know, yeah. So
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question. There are kind of two questions there. The first one with the
yeah.
Balkan War is that there's an important reminder, actually, that there usually aren't that many good guys. And with
Right.
the hard right now, actually, you get some people making this point even about World War II, and I don't entirely agree with it. I mean, I think that Churchill and Roosevelt were better than Hitler and Mussolini or Stalin. But I mean,
Mhm.
the basic idea of, yeah, you know, we firebombed Dresden and killed 100,000 people, and then we nuclear bombed Tokyo or Hiroshima and Nagasaki. You know, I think all those were justified, but it's important to realize that ultimate morals are fairly rare, and to understand that an educated Japanese looking at that would probably say, well, they committed nearly as many war crimes as we did, and they'd have quite a defensible position there. And World War II is one of the more morally justifiable wars in the game. I mean, in most wars, you just have a bunch of people fighting because young men's lives are fairly cheap. Bluntly, young men can't have babies, they don't yet own homes. And so they've often been viewed as kind of negotiating chips when it comes to getting very valuable
Mm.
pieces of land, like huge blocks of the Caucasus Mountains and so on. And I don't really see anything wrong with that, assuming that people are signing up for the military mostly consensually and so on these days. Um, you know, so in the Balkans, we decided that the Serbs were the bad guys, basically. And as I've looked through this, the only reason for that seemed to be that they were winning the war. I
Mm.
mean, we keep saying, well, the Serbs were torturing their prisoners, they were taking cities, and there was more than 2% of the men in those cities were executed. They were doing this and this. But like, if you actually read through the records of that war, the Croatians, who were the descendants of the Ustashi in World War II, they were doing worse things. The Kosovars, the Muslims, the Bosnians, and the Albanians, that's the group we probably should have least liked when you think about it. I mean, these are radical Eastern, these are Russian Muslims, if you think about who America fights with. I'm exaggerating that a little bit. But
Yeah.
in the end, they ended up getting 2 states out of that. I mean, Kosovar, Albania, and Bosnia. So we kind of just picked a group. We said, well, they haven't committed quite as many atrocities. Let's ride with them. And I've never understood a logical argument for what we did in that war. We could have stayed out of that war. We could have backed the winning side. We were just like, nope, we think the loser's slightly less of an asshole. So here's whatever $600 billion in weapons.
Yeah.
I mean, NATO conducted formal airstrikes. Anyway, most places are like that. In South Africa, are the blacks or the whites the good guys? I mean, neither one is probably the good guys.
Right. One thing that happened too is a byproduct, but that's what happens when you fuck around with other stuff that you don't know about. Speaking of farming, we'll go foreign policy. When we go into the Balkan region and bring all that money, all that influence, and we back there are no innocent people, right? I don't care if you're a Bosnian Serb or a Serbian, Croat. It doesn't matter. Like, these guys move around. One of the things happened is we gave purchase for, I don't want to say Al Qaeda necessarily, but Al Qaeda started operating in the area. And I will tell you, after meeting a lot of country ass Bosnians, farmers, these guys were, if there's such a term as Jack Muslims, that's what they all were. They raised pigs. They made their own booze. I mean, these guys were not hardened Muslims and Islamics. They just weren't. And so now you can find that. You can find those sects. So by going in there, we allowed our enemy, in this case, Al Qaeda, to plant seeds and poison young minds. So, gosh, isn't that negative right there, just with that part of it, where you're in Europe? Yes, they're Russians of a sort, and yes, they're Islamic, but they were drinking and eating pig. Medium rare pig at that. Well, medium rare. Come on.
Medium rare pig. Yeah, I mean, they're definitely, it's hard to separate an Eastern European from pork. So, I mean, that's that may be one of the toughest issues Islam has in the region. But yeah, like the point about Al Qaeda is very accurate. Sorry, for some reason I'm blinking a lot. I don't know. I think it might be light above me, but I'm just gonna blink erratically for a couple minutes. But anyway, let me actually stop this and press my eye. Anyway, but so the thing with Al Qaeda actually is have you read Jesse Petrilla's book, If It Takes 1,000 Years?
No, I'll put a link up for it.
Petrilla's an interesting guy. He's a former Army guy, I think Army Ranger, but he was a guest on one of my podcasts pretty recently, and he wrote a book called If It Takes 1,000 Years about kind of the perspective that the Islamics and also the Chinese have on war and conflict as versus the West. And one of his points is that there's a totally different understanding of history. Like, if you're debating an educated Muslim, they'll refer to the Templar Knights and say, oh, we're going to get you back for the Battle of Guernica. And it's all in good faith, but most Western whites or blacks or whatever have no idea what's even being referred to. But one of the chapters in the book is about the intrusion of Islam into Europe. And a lot of it's just about, French schools and so on. But one of the things he mentions is that in Eastern Europe, there's actually mass funding of mosques by Al Qaeda and other groups. And that's something that began with the Bosnian War in the Balkans. Yeah. So that's kind of interesting. And this is all fundamentalist traditional Islam. Like, this is Shia Islam. So you've got a lot of people, when we arrested people, and you probably saw this in person, but when we were making arrests during the GWAT in these foreign countries, including Afghanistan, we'd frequently find guys from Chechnya, Canada, Bosnia. I mean, the forces were 20, 30% Caucasians, not counting Arabs, and they were from all around the world. And the reason for that is that very rich Muslim countries like Qatar are sponsoring this new type of Islam being taught globally. So the question is, what do we do about that, if anything?
Right. I'm going to put a link up for Ayman Dean's book here as well. So here's the link for the book that Will was talking about. Sorry for calling you Bill and Phil. It takes 1,000 years there. So that's down below. And then here's 9 Lives. That's written by a guy named Ayman Dean, who was inside Al Qaeda as an actual recruitee. And then he flipped on him and ran double agent ops for MI6 inside of Al Qaeda. And he talks about his time. In part of the story, he talks about his time being in Bosnia. And this is crazy to me because I'm there, and the last thing I'm looking for are Islamic dudes running. And I really didn't come across any, right? It was all Europeans where we were. but we also were there in 96. So a couple of years later, when they get their ops running, and they start inculcating for sure. And I've got friends who came after me who did my job, and we're looking at that threat. And so it's interesting. It's an interesting thing to think about because they'll take their time to get back for those things. So I wanted just to point out those couple of books and go from there. Do you want to say anything else about Al Qaeda, the Balkans, or South Africa, or do you want to move on to something else?
Well, we can move on to something else, but I mean, I will do one line about South Africa. This also pulls in the Balkans and so on, which is just remember that there usually aren't any magical good guys, any Prince Charmings or anything like that in these foreign situations. Any diplomat, any former soldier will tell you that. Black race, the white race, the Israeli race, why can't they all run together? I support greater racial togetherness. I'm what's called a civic nationalist. I think that it's fairly easy to make everyone kind of follow the Roman eagle. So you have Gallic and Ethiopian and so on legionnaires that have a similar religion, a similar set of beliefs. You all have to speak the same language. Even in those situations, you do have some ethnic tensions, but it's quite easy to get there, and we should. A problem in the USA is that for the past 50 years, we've been teaching anti-civilization. Like when I debate with feminists online and they say things like, I don't have to ever sleep with my husband to make him happy, or the requirement that I run the house if I don't work is abuse. Or when I talk to critical race theorists and they say things like any gap between people represents oppression, you realize that someone's been pumping this fucking nonsense into people's heads for generations now. So I mean that's why we're not civic nationalists anymore. And if you're not a civic national country, you actually can't be a diverse state. People simply fracture into factions. You have to be a fairly confident, proud, preferably imperial, but it works for republics as well, nation for the idea of nationalism to even exist. And nationalism is sort of a dirty word these days. But anyway, my basic point about South Africa and the Balkans was just there usually are no good guys. There are usually two groups of people who are somewhat heroic and somewhat assholish, as all people are, that are fighting because they've been fighting for 200 years. Last South Africa point ever, but the Boer got to South Africa before the blacks did. This is something that's been contested in political science, but is now pretty much accepted. They touched the Cape of Good Hope, and Pete, you might correct this, but like 1652, and they started conquering north. Like honestly, they killed a whole bunch of people. But the Zulu under Shaka, the black tribe that everyone knows, got there in, I think, 1786. Again, could easily be off by a couple of years. But this is the result of the Zulu Mfukane, where they conquered a massive area of southern and southwestern Africa. And then they moved into South Africa. They crossed the Fish River. And these were iron-using, organized groups of people. They had cattle. They knew how to farm. And they clashed with the whites, who, at that distance from Europe, weren't much more, quote-unquote, civilized. And the two butchered each other for a while. And then they reached a rough detente. The Boers got some great victories, actually, from a pure military science perspective. I mean, the Battle of Blood River, because their weapons shot farther. I think they killed 3,000 Zulus and lost 12 people or something like that. So, I mean, it's an impressive, from a military history standpoint, it's interesting.
Yeah, well, and these military histories matter because it drives the politics of that region. I was having a little bit of a conversation with someone who posted a silly political meme talking about how these are all Mexican words, and it was like San Anselmo, Santa Barbara. And I'm like, yeah, those are Spanish words, and Mexico owned California in this case for about 30 years. So of all of the ownership eras of California at all. In that whole thing, it's Spain and then the United States, but we refuse to understand that treaties matter, wars matter. You fight a war, you lose, there's consequences. You fight a war, you win, there's consequences. And it doesn't mean that everybody's gentle and easy, as you were saying earlier, lots of bad guys. But yeah, the other thing is that's a conundrum, a dichotomy, some kind of disagreement between diversity and unity, right? So if unity is nationalism and we're focused on diversity, at some point you have to choose to be a tree, otherwise you're air. I mean, very kind of philosophical, but you have to want to go in the same direction on most occasions, otherwise you're not a country. You're something more akin to Afghanistan, where it's focused on tribe, and you can't get anything done on a big scale. And this is a problem here in California, is because everybody has rights. Everybody and everything has rights. We have advocates for animals, for groups of people who are not empowered, all kinds of things. So that when you're like, I would like to build something that does this to this. And they're like, no, because of all of these people that want to take you to court. So it's a bit of a rave about, a rant about disparity, and the problem with just saying, we want to be diverse. And if really what you mean is ethnicity, then say that. If you want to have more ethnicities, that's great. If you want to have different cultures, great, say that. But when we act like color of skin is the most important thing when it comes to people, it shouldn't be. And I don't think that it is as important as we want it to be. But we can't allow that to divide us so much that we are no longer capable of doing something together. So says Pete.
Yeah, no, that's obviously true. I mean, diversity has advantages. I've actually gotten kind of tired of listing them because it has disadvantages too. But it's important to keep that in mind. I mean, diversity correlates positively with everything. Yeah, it correlates with everything from cosmopolitanism to improved dating environment, better food, patent rate. Obviously, different groups tend to develop in different fields. You're going to have more Olympic gold medals, even if you've got whites, blacks, and Asians in your squad. So, I mean, there's some pluses, but a major minus of diversity is that it decreases trust and kind of together-eyed is a good way to think of it. So you have to balance, you have to promote the positives, but also balance out the negatives by formally acknowledging they exist and then ruthlessly training people. And formally acknowledging problems and then ruthlessly training people isn't really like a left-wing American specialty, to put it pretty mildly. So, I mean, we've seen a lot of issues recently. One of the things you just said about California that's interesting is that rights are trump cards. So, and that line's not original to me, but when you have rights, the discussion stops. So in terms of every situation that I just outlined, even the feminist and bro husband debating how frequently sex should happen, normally what happens is that people just pick something in the middle that won't make either person miserable and call it date night or something like that, and then move on. You compromise on almost everything. But that's just how it works. Like if I'm on a sales team with 3 other guys, we're going to divide up the leads in a pack of 4s. It's what you do. Rights actually prevent that. And this is something I don't think people think enough about. A right is a provision in law stating that you will always receive something no matter what seems logical. So why does it take so long to build in California? I've actually talked about this with Armin Domaleski, the intelligent leftist on social media. The simple reason is that, like you said, everything has a right. So there's a mandatory environmental assessment of any potential building site before you put up a building, because snail darters have rights. Then, there's an ecological, they bring in an archaeologist, right, for big buildings. Like, are there any native ruins there? So you can't build because the defeated enemies have rights. And then you go on into, like, if you build the building, you've got to have wheelchair ramps and triple elevator shafts and so on, because blind, crippled people have rights. And I actually kind of support that one. A lot of those people are veterans and so on. But you just go on and on through the bullshit. Like the group of people that build the building have to be, I think, out there 30% Hispanic, because affirmative action is the law. So when you have rights, you can't just negotiate things anymore. You can't just say, hey, I'm willing to do 15% Hispanics on this project, but I'm a white-owned, Irish-owned construction company, because the right says, well, it's 30%. If you can't find 30% Hispanics, it looks like you're not building this year. So the more of that you have, the more difficult everything becomes. And this is why you see this crazy stuff like China. Have you ever seen the graphic where China, it's the railroads in China in 2006 and then 2024? And they just like tripled their railroad coverage because they're basically a dictatorship. They can. And there are lots of hungry young men that want to work as opposed to being in the Chinese army these days. So in the USA, we couldn't do that. We'd have to go through that approval process I described, plus a whole bunch of state processes for every single railroad we wanted to build. And that's why we don't have high-speed rail. That's actually just the reason. There's not a lot of debate about it.
Right. And I'm really, I love interacting with the transportation people and the NIMBY folks. I like to say, hey, don't worry so much. We have more rail than anybody else. We move more things on rail. And they get so mad about this, and they go straight to authoritarianism. They're like, you will obey the transportation things. They just want to always use the stick. And they don't understand, like, if we wanted to move fruit on rail, we could, except for people have rights. And if you want to use the term big fruit, they don't want to do that. And the unions that do that, they don't want to do that. And all of a sudden you end up in court, like, all we want to do is build a slow, steady train that goes from here to somewhere else and put a bunch of fruit on it. You will not do that. The safest way to transport petrochemicals like oil and things like that is through pipelines. It's the safest way to do it. Rail is probably next best. The worst way is to put it on a ship that burns bunker fuel and haul ass across the world. It's the most pollutingest way. But because we have rights, we offshore all of that pollution and all that abuse. And we do this sort of thing all the time. So we have tons of rail and we use it for things that, like, rail is not great for moving people. It's just not, because at the scale of life, you need too many. It's hard to do multimodal. Are there small scale examples of works? Sure. Right. But we can't agree on that. And so what that does here in California, it's a really weird thing, is it takes our liberal nature and it makes us hyper conservative. And to use a Victor Davis Hanson term, it calcifies us into this current state. And you're not politically conservative, but you're operationally conservative, and you cannot change things. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's actually a pretty good point. When we think of a conservative, we think of kind of a throne and altar guy who prefers things as they are. But after 50 to 70 years of high-level liberal government, we're in a weird situation when almost all of the precedent is liberal. This is something other than you. I've only heard Antonin Scalia mention this, but it's an issue for originalists on the Supreme Court, right? So, like, the originalist is the guy who thinks that basically cases should be decided based on what the word of the Constitution would have meant in 1776. But secondarily, by looking at precedent, we should have great honor for precedent, Clarence Thomas's old line, and so on. The issue today, though, is that all of the precedent is on the left. So, like Roe v. Wade, you can get an abortion technically into the 9th month, was legal precedent. Brown v. Board, and I think we're all on the side of this one, but you can never segregate in institutions, was legal precedent. And it's just so on down the line. Pretty much ever. Dobbs v. whatever. Duke Power. Duke Power is the case I was thinking of. Griggs v. Duke Power, where you can't use IQ tests for the majority of job roles because there are some racial group gaps on them even today. All of that is already in the law. So you're in this weird situation where the liberal is actually the one saying, like, hey, no, you can't get rid of these decisions. You can't get rid of these packages of rights, so on down the line. And the conservative is the one saying very often, like, well, we just want to take the potatoes and move them from Boise to San Diego. And that's almost impossible today. So, at some point, I guess, as a conservative, you have to be radical or reactionary against entrenched liberalism. Like, it doesn't make sense for the conservative to say, or the businessman to say, well, hey, I guess that if we look at the 180 idiotic laws regulating this, there's no way to move potatoes. You have to, one, want to move the potatoes, but two, be willing to get rid of the idiotic laws. And two is pretty important.
Yeah. And I would even say, like, if you want to move potatoes, we already move potatoes and we haven't needed rail to do it. So what's going to make it, if we care about the environment, and this is always a great way to start, if we care about the environment, we would move oil. California would reap its own oil and natural gas harvest if we cared about the environment. If we don't, then let's not talk about the environment anymore as a policy driver, because then it's a different thing. But there's already very efficient systems for moving things. We moved more shit than anybody else. I did the math on this, Will. So this is peak grade research. So feel free to smash it apart. But if you just take the amount of stuff that moves on rail, it's about 500,000 pounds a year per person. All of it, cardboard, engine parts, gravel, all that shit. We all consume about 500,000 pounds worth of shit. So even if it's not individual, even if that's the wrong way to count that, all that stuff still has to move. And is it better to build trains? I don't know, but I do know this: nobody seems to want to do it. Otherwise, they would do it. And when we put these weights on a project, like, oh, you have to have affordable housing instead of just housing. Well, now the person who owns it is like, I don't got money for that. And the other thing, and there's no money for that. I can't do it. I'll put my money in something else like AI or something. And it impacts our ability to go forward on things, assuming that we need to go forward on those things.
Yeah, I don't actually have a very moral take on a lot of this. I think a lot of things like AI are kind of just going to happen.
Yeah.
I actually think the impact of some of them will be negative. I can't imagine that being able well, it depends what you even mean, right? Like,
yeah,
I would say that the ability to constantly pull up assistance from AI and from Google before Grok and from any of this stuff, like you have a calculator on your phone, you probably have almost none of the abilities that almost everyone who is intelligent had in earlier generations. But you also have these devices that really link to your brain almost, that are in your hand, that give
Yeah.
you these skills. So is that good or bad? I don't know. I mean, I would probably try to. Do you know what the Butlerian Jihad is?
No.
Okay, in Dune, the sci-fi series, there's a point where they this lunatic leader named Butler, who was kind of the galactic lunatic leader before the star of Dune, which is Paul Muad'Dib, the Mahdi. But
Okay.
Butler launches the Butlerian Jihad, where the slogan is "You shall not make a machine or an image in the style of a man." So they destroy all the robots and all the computers that have what we would think of as modern levels of computing, and so on down the line. I'm actually kind of sympathetic to that. Like, I
Hmm.
think if we passed a law against building sapient robots, AI models, what a recombinant DNA research, where every so often someone's army will get caught trying to inject tiger DNA into people. It doesn't make them grow fur, but it makes them see in the dark and move more rapidly. I think that would be good. I think the impact of that law would be positive. But I don't think we're going to do that. And I also think there'd be so much illegal stuff done that it would be impossible to track.
Hmm.
So, I mean, in reality, artificial intelligence and all that is with us. But to the extent that we can, we should definitely get rid of human created barriers to development. I mean,
Okay.
the classic situation was in California, right, where they were going to begin relumbering in the Great North Woods that run into Oregon, but they found the spotted owl. So the people that opposed lumbering no longer just said, well, we oppose cutting down trees and
Right.
burning them to heat homes. We are defenders of the spotted owl. And you started seeing these cute owls appear on posters and so on. So all of that is artificial and designed to stymie progress to a certain extent. We should be very intolerant of it.
Yeah. 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 Well, we're not. Suckers, we fall for the same thing over and over again. When you look at, I'm going to change topics. When you look at the tariff thing, obviously when you mess with the financial systems, people freak out. But it appears that we're going to withstand this change, and it might even seem that, given all of the money coming into the states now, that it's been a pretty good move. But TBD. What are your thoughts on where we are with that policy?
With which policy?
Just the tariff policy and trying to rebalance trade with other places.
Yeah, sorry, there's a bit of a blip there. So what do I think about tariff policy? I'm actually not a big fan of tariffs. Like, I'm one of those people that genuinely doesn't think trade deficits matter very much. Like, the classic example would be that I have a trade deficit with Brooks Brothers. Like, every time
Hmm.
I go there, I give them money and they give me
Hmm.
clothing. So if you're looking at the financial side of this, like, they have a 100% trade edge. I don't really think that's all that relevant. So, I mean, if, for example, Suriname grows the best pineapples in the world and we buy all the pineapples, and they don't really have much of a market for luxury cars or something over in Suriname. So the trade deficit is 65-35 with them. I don't really see that as a problem at all. I don't see why we would want Suriname to minimize its one successful farming sector and do other stuff to maximize their ability to purchase goods from us. I mean, that's kind of a clumsy explanation, but I don't really know if these matter.
Yeah.
The
Yeah.
tariffs in general, the problem with tariffs is that they just increase prices for the country that's implementing them. So I mean, a tariff is essentially a 20% levy tax if you're using a 20% rate on something coming into your country. So if we put a 20% tariff on French goods, what that means is that we get fine cheeses and wines and so on in. The sellers in the USA are just going to mark the price of them up 20% to compensate for the tariff. Um, the only use for tariffs that I could see, and Trump's a good enough negotiator that this might be what he's doing, but is to create a state of mutually assured destruction, right? So people
Mm.
know that if they put a 30% tariff on the good old USA's products, we're going to respond with a 30% tariff on their products, which will mean that, this will have to be handled by importers from the tariff country before those things enter the USA. Fewer of them will be sold in USA, so on down the line. But in general, I oppose tariffs. Like, if we don't have a tariff on another country and they do have a tariff on us, at some level, what that means is that products here are cheaper. So that's the flip side of it. That
Yeah.
if the French goods here have a 0% tariff, they just cost. We'll still punish them, we'll tax them a little bit, but they cost roughly what the best American goods do. So people can just rationally make a decision about which they want. Whereas in another country, if there's a 30% tariff on American goods, anything they want to buy from, say, Ford, is amped up in price, making the average person's day-to-day life worse. And there are counter arguments, of course, but I don't tend to see much of an advantage to, like, France has a 2% tariff. We have a 0% tariff. Trump penalizes France with 10%. France is big enough to respond with 10%. I think in practice, that's just going to make life in the USA and France worse. The goal is that France would throw off their 2% tariff, but that's only happened about half the time. Like, the USA and China right now, like, we both suspended our tariffs after a bunch of dick waving. But, like, if those are re-implemented in 90 days, I think we're now at 104%, and they're at 80%. So that actually makes things dramatically worse than would have been the case in the baseline, like 5 and 10% condition. So it's a gambler's game, and I don't really think it's always a very wise one.
It has turned into revenue coming into the States to increase capacity to build things here. Is that a net good then?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question. I mean, a lot of these things are really almost moral questions. So, like, if we are tariffing Chinese and French goods at 20%, and that means that 30% of the goods on the shelves from those two giant countries are now 20% more if you go to the grocery store. Think how much European and Chinese food there is in that you eat.
Right. Yeah.
The question is, so, like, objectively, that makes your life worse. But the question is, will that then drive you to purchase American goods or close ally Canadian goods or something like that? And isn't that a good thing? That would be one response. I mean, another comment would be what you said. Yeah, like, are we going to use the money from these tariffs to do anything? That's another argument. The USA is broke. We could use any source of money that we come across right now. Honestly, I hope we do. But
Yeah.
yeah, not a huge fan, but I see some reasons for a tariff regime. That's the short answer. I'm also not an economist, so a lot of what I'm saying is just like smart guy talking.
Yeah. No, I get you. And TBD on if this stuff works bad or end up about the same spot. Who knows, right? We definitely don't have a problem spending money that we don't have in this country as a country and as a body, as a demos. The big question I want to ask you now is, if the boss called you up and said, "Will, I need you to come in and give me some ideas on things," right? Because he seems pretty open to this kind of thing.
Okay.
What are you going to tell him? What do you think you should do?
Well, actually, I may get to meet Trump. I mean, myself and a couple friends. You obviously know Brooks Crenshaw, Kevin Jackson from Fox. We're setting up a consultancy that's actually based around the idea of getting DEI out of corporations, like having people like James Lindsay read their praxis, their handbooks, and so on. And then, going in, teaching about what the roots are of what they've been introducing people to, and countering with a methodology based around sort of military HR, just hire the best. Like, Brooks and I from different backgrounds have little charts, frameworks about how to do that. But anyway, one of the things that a couple potential clients have told us is you guys should go to Mar-a-Lago and, meet Trump. And apparently that's a thing you can do. Like, I mean, there are, like, he invites several thousand people there for balls. Their email list that at least myself and Kevin are on, that I've always thought were a joke, but you can go meet the big hoss. So if I get a chance to meet Trump, I actually will. But like, what am I going to say to him? I'm going to shake his hand and be like, "Good job, Mr. President," and then move on because there's 500 guys behind me. But, like, if I had a chance to sit down with Trump and talk to him, an honest piece of advice I would give Trump is shut up more. I wouldn't phrase it like that, but it's a problem that most male leaders have. Like, when we talk about these meetings with what's his name from Ukraine, Zelensky, and with Ramaphosa, a lot of that stuff could have been handled behind the scenes. Like, if you don't humiliate Ramaphosa, but you say, like, the oil deal's not happening, if I get word of another 50 whites killed, then Ramaphosa is probably going to do something to secure those properties. He's probably going to tell urban gangs what's going to happen at the hands of the excellent integrated South African military if that shit occurs again. If you say it in public to his face, he's got to defend his people and say, "What? I've never heard of interracial crime in South Africa." And of course, it's absurd, but you've now pushed him into a corner, and he's a powerful guy himself. So that'd be a piece of advice: to shut your mouth. Don't argue with Roseanne Barr on Twitter. Like, one, Roseanne's probably going to win that exchange. But also,
Yeah.
two, you're the president. You're not supposed to be talking about who's fat and who has a small dick on social media. Like, come on. That'd be my
Yeah.
big piece of advice. On policy, I like Trump, but
Mhm.
it'd be, one, just keep quiet about certain things. Two, even on the policy front, be consistent and understand what you can be consistent about. So when Trump put 10% tariffs on every country in the world, like, you understand that's probably not a policy that's going to endure. Like, if England quietly calls you behind the scenes and says, "Hey, mate, we might not participate in the next war unless you drop that to 8." Like, in one day, you're already changing what looks like your red line. So
Yeah.
basically, it's all the same thing. Less bluster. Like, have a
Mm.
set plan for how you're going to deal with these people there in corporate DC that want you to fail. Center everything around that and pursue real policy. The thing Trump's been very good on, actually, is and it's kind of funny for me to say this as a black guy, but is his comeback to DEI, where he's done all
Mm.
these subtle things. Like, he removed the 1964 Richard Nixon executive order, which said that the federal government won't do business with companies that don't practice proportional representation. And that's how affirmative action works. Like, most companies know they'll be sued if they don't have a proportional number of blacks, Hispanics, women. All these groups vary in qualifications between like Asian to white to ADOS black to like recent Latino immigrant to like feminist recent Latino immigrant. Like, there's an incredible range of quality. And affirmative action is essentially the act of ignoring that range. Like, acting like the recent Latino immigrant and the Asian guy have the same qualifications and hiring them both proportionately.
Right.
And it looks like,
Yeah.
to a legal mind, Trump just ended that. So he's making some big moves just to keep things calm, balanced. That's Trump's problem.
Yeah. I would love it if someone on his staff walked around and said, "Hey, you've said this word doesn't belong to me 132 times. You have 3 more times, and then we're never going to say that again. You need to find new things to say. You need to guide us in a new direction." But he just, again, so half his speech is performative, almost like it's an Islamic text. Praise be Allah. Allah must be praised because we must, of course, praise Allah. Praise Allah. Alhamdulillah. And then on to the next thing. And then you have to do that again. And it's this whole dance, right? He has to stop doing that, because that, to me, the communication guy, is not helping him. It's just this repetitive, almost spasmodic response to things. And just, yeah, say the thing however many times you need to say it, but then shut up about it and then say, here's where we're at today, and stop talking about the last guy. Talk about going forward. That's his job. All right. What else do you want to cover? Anything else, or should we wrap this thing up?
Probably got to wrap it up. I'm actually gonna meet Brooks in like 20 minutes. Yeah, we're gonna work out a little bit. But
send my regards to Brooks when you see him.
I will indeed. But I'm glad to jump back on the show at pretty much any time, honestly.
Yeah. Well, we'll do another one again soon. Everybody, this is the Break It Down Show. Make sure you subscribe if you haven't seen us before. Make sure you go to get all of Will's books, because Will's books are awesome. And I'm going to tell you the link right here. Yep, I'm going to find it. There it is right here. Here's a great link for all of Will's books. Go to Amazon and do that, or just go wherever you buy books and just buy any of them. You're going to love them. Stand by 1 second. I'll say goodbye to you. Everybody else, I'll see you maybe tomorrow, maybe not.